Welcome everyone. Top Tasks is about essentially answering two questions. What matters and what doesn't matter so much. And I've been 25 years basically helping and designing web environments and software. And the challenge of focus has always been there. And one of the constant recurrent themes is, but this is important as well, and this is important as well, and this is important. And, you know, when we make everything important, unfortunately, nothing becomes important. So Top Tasks is about the difficult but necessary process of prioritization. It's a prioritization model, saying focus on these here, and by definition, defocus. You cannot focus on everything. And I know most people who have the best will and the best intents when they approach, you know, let's publish more, let's create content about this or this area. But it doesn't work. You know, we need to have a website that we can manage. We need to have a website where people can find stuff. We need to have an application that is properly searchable. And the more stuff you put in, particularly in an unstructured manner, the more difficult that is to achieve. So, excuse me, sorry. Top Tasks, there's three major areas in Top Tasks. The first and foundational area is the identification. So many organizations will just do the identification. They won't go on to these next phases, or they'll take different techniques or different approaches to go on to the next phases. But the anchor, the foundational element of Top Tasks over the years has been Top Task identification. Classification is often a problem that's thrown up, you know, from the Top Task process, that there's a poor classification, there's a poor environment. I know nobody wants to invest in classification these days, but it is one of the most essential things you can do to create a really good, you know, useful, findable, sustainable digital environment. So I'm going to briefly look at the Top Task classification process. Then measuring the top tasks is what we call task performance indicator. And that is an ongoing process. Excuse me, sorry. An ongoing process where you're continuously measuring examples, typically of the top 10 to 12 tasks on an ongoing basis, and making improvements based on the findings from those measurements. And you're constantly seeking to improve the success rate and reduce the time on task. So I'm going to relatively briefly go through, you know, these areas and explain them in a little bit more detail. So task identification, top task identification. It's a survey. It's research, basically. Survey-based research, and the survey has three components. The tasks, which is what makes it unique from many other surveys. So there's a whole process of putting these tasks together. Then the experience. What's it like as you're trying to complete the task? I'm not going to go into this element in any great detail in this overview. And the segmentation. So the combination of segmentation or category or demographic questions with the task gives us deeper insight. And I'll give you some examples there. So the essence of task identification is the task list. The most important thing you can do and the easiest thing to get wrong is building this task list. So this was a project we did with WHO back when the pandemic was just really gaining momentum around May 2020. And we basically talked to doctors and researchers and academics and, you know, nurses, and looked at search behaviour, looked at page visits, looked at the NHS, the UK NHS and Canadian and loads of other health environments, read up the media, looked on social media, went through a big process to compile all the things that could be important in relation to COVID-19, the coronavirus disease. And there was a big collaborative exercise within WHO to agree and refine. Initially, there were hundreds and hundreds of things, and then we refined them down to this list, about 79 tasks. Typically, in any top task environment, there's somewhere between 50 and 80. Rarely, if ever, do we ever go over 100. That's a very, very high load. But in 90 to 95% of the cases, the number of tasks are somewhere between 50 and 80. And then literally, we go out to the target audience, the users, and ask them to vote to choose no more than 5 from this list. And we randomize this list. And it is absolutely essential that it is a single list. Otherwise, you're using a different method. You're not using top tasks. And I know people constantly who look at this initially say, but that can't work. There's too many. There's a whole logic and there's a whole science behind this and there's a whole psychology behind this. And I can't go into it here today because it's just an overview. But there are reasons for this, and part of it is to overload people so their gut instinct kicks in, or some other people to really force them to think, force them to choose the most important stuff to them. And out of that, we always get really strong patterns. So we got over thousands of people voting from over 100 countries in this WHO study, which was carried out in May 2020. And we see here that 9 tasks, so the yellow tasks, we tend to say are the top tasks. That's the first 25% of the vote. Medium is the 25 to 50. So the top task family is a kind of the yellow and green, the first 50% of the vote. So 9 tasks got as much of the vote as the bottom 38. Now, 9 is the most we have ever found in any top task study. So we've never found more than 9 in the yellow actual space, because this is a very complicated environment, with people from over 100. I think there was 130 countries represented in the vote. So very complicated environment. Typically, the yellow is about 3 to 5. That's a typical top task environment. But this was more exceptional environment, more complicated. And we see what's first. It's vaccine. And you say, oh, that's obvious. Well, it wasn't that obvious back in May 2020. And there was little or no content on any of the health websites about the vaccine. Now, I know it was under development, but there was nothing. People wanted to know about, the development process, when roughly availability, safety issues, etc. But there was nothing on a lot of sites. So number 2, latest news. Number 3, transmission spread, immunity, antibody testing. This was May 2020. So the core deliverable of a top task project is the league table. It gives you this hierarchy of importance. And it's not to say that the stuff at the bottom of the list is not important. In some contexts, it's absolutely critical. But it's just saying that the most important things are the vaccine, the latest news, the transmission spread. So in the design and the hierarchy, we should be focusing on those more than what we are focusing on what is at the bottom of the list. So it's not to say that what's at the bottom of the list will not be findable, but it will be deeper down in the architecture, and it will not be allowed to disrupt the journeys for the top tasks. This is the critical component of top task design. It's about making hard decisions, and the top task identification process is about giving you the evidence to make those difficult and hard decisions in the process. Also, by having the same list, we can do all sorts of interesting statistical analysis. So here we can look, this is some extra analysis we do with our software. We say, well, for those who voted for vaccine, what were they next most likely to vote for? So the people who voted for vaccine, they were next most likely to vote for drugs. then for immunity, then food, medicines, essential products, then end date, new normal. They were most likely to be from Canada, to be concerned about a member of your family, an infrequent user. So we can combine all this around the tasks and get this view, which can really help content writers or forward links, or all sorts of good insights can be got from this as well. So we see here the stability of the vote. This is what I call a stability chart. And there were 3,000 people voted. Typically, we look for 400. Even after 200, even after 100, you're beginning to see the top task actually emerge. But in ideal circumstances, we're looking for 400 or more. So if we're seeing lots of fluctuations in the colors, particularly if we're seeing turquoise or white come into the color as a lot, we're worried that it didn't stabilize. So we're looking here roughly 800, a quarter is roughly 800 voters or so, and you're seeing it's very stable. And top tasks tend to stabilize really well at 400, and even at 100 voters, your top 2 or 3 tasks usually have emerged quite strongly. So we see here another way of looking at the data. The vaccine is beginning to become a little bit of a super task, even back in May 2020. Which is a long time ago in the pandemic environment. Now a study was done for WHO. We also did 4 distinct studies for countries. So we did Ireland, we did Canada, New Zealand, and Norway. And even in the other countries, we were seeing the same basic patterns emerge. In Ireland, the vaccine was emerging very strongly as well, as we can see here. Now, the Irish Health Environment actually ran the top task study throughout the pandemic, which I thought was very interesting, because people often say to me, well, do tasks change? And usually they don't. See, designing based on tasks, you can really design for the long term. It's a much better way to design from the long term than, for example, based on, organizational structure or systems or things like that. Tasks tend to have a long-term life to them. So the first poll that the Irish Health Service ran was in May 2020. We see vaccine is number 1, new outbreak, number 2, workplace is number 3, mental health number 4. They ran it again in November 2020. Mental well-being was now number 1, vaccine number 2, symptoms number 3. So you see there's quite a bit of stability, but there are some shifts in the data. So they ran it again in May 2021. Vaccine is again number 1, mental health number 2, travel restrictions number 3. So you see vaccine was number 1, number 2, number 1. Mental health was 4th, 1st and 2nd. Travel restrictions 5th, 4th and 3rd. So we see a lot, even in a rapidly changing pandemic, we see a lot of basic consistency in the task-based structure. So the Irish Health Environment said, hey, vaccine, is going to be rolled out. This was back around May or June 2021. So let's really try and understand the vaccine top tasks as much as possible. So this is a level lower of top tasks that you can actually do. So we went through the same exercise to pull together all the tasks that might be important in relation to a vaccine in the process. Who's the maker? Is it mandatory or voluntary? Safety, evidence of safety. Went out this in Ireland. There was 4,000 voters to this. You see how it's rock solid. 30% of the vote, or a quarter of the voters, immunity. 29%, 30%, 30%. So basically, people had up to 5 choices. So the immunity after getting the vaccine. And some people say to me about top tasks that, oh, you're not going to be dealing with minority needs. That's not necessarily true. The top tasks tend to be consistent across multiple audience groups. It's the delivery of the tasks that often exclude the minorities, not the actual tasks themselves. Everybody wants to know about immunity after getting the vaccine. Everybody wants to know about long-term side effects. Everybody wants to know about vaccine effectiveness. Top tasks do not exclude audiences in the process. Often the tiny tasks, those at the bottom of the list, are much more political analytical. It is the tiny tasks that often do far more excluding by polluting the homepage and dominating the structure and hiding and making it more difficult for people to find the essential stuff that they need to find to do their jobs. So you remember earlier I talked about the segmentation questions in the process. So here we can see across this categorization segmentation questions, at this moment, how likely are you to get the COVID-19 vaccine? So generally speaking, we find a tremendous amount of commonality across segments, whether it's gender, whether it's age. The top tasks tend to be common across multiple groups. Here, we're seeing a bit of difference in the process. We're seeing people who are unlikely, not sure, likely, very likely, they're broadly a very similar task, but then the very unlikely group have quite distinctively different tasks, but even share a couple of the top tasks in the process. So here we see the unlikely, we look at the unlikely stuff, and you say, you can see that long-term side effects is the number one, safety, common side effects, but they're also interested in immunity. They're also interested in the vaccine itself. So they're not lost from, say, a communication point of view, whereas the very unlikely group, have a very different sort of task. So by combining the segmentation questions with the task voting, you can get all sorts of interesting insights. So we see here a top task for very unlikely is genetic code in the vaccine, DNA implications, whereas that's not an important task for any other group. They see vaccines as a means to control people is in the top task family for them, but it's not at all an issue for the other groups in the process. One of the deliverables from this was an architecture. Now, this architecture did evolve as the vaccine rollout evolved, but it helped give us a sense of what's the major groups, what's the major issues that people are concerned with. So, just going to give maybe one other example of the top task in action or a deliverable of that. The US Internal Revenue Service has used the top task philosophy and approach over many years. And this was an Internal Revenue Service site a number of years ago for tax for businesses. And it was just everything was published in a massive long list. And basically people couldn't find anything and certainly couldn't find the essential stuff. And then they went to this. This is a top task approach. You may think now, oh, this is really obvious. This has been a major fight over 25 years to get to this sort of focus in the process. It may seem obvious now, but it wasn't obvious for many years. So the employee ID number, EIN, employment tax, estimated tax, foreign account tax compliance. So these are the dominant things that they're getting constant questions for. So one of the interesting things that they found was that when they went to this new task-based, top task-based structure, on-page site dropped by 33%. So why did that happen? Why did they get a big, and this is why we need to be careful about search, saying, lots of people are searching for stuff because they can't find it through the navigation. It's not necessarily meaning that, you should be really relying totally on search. Search can fluctuate. The worse the navigation is, the more that you will find in search that are top tasks. The better the navigation is, the more search will reflect the tiny tasks or the exceptional stuff in the process. So what they were finding was in the old site that people would put in a search for EIN, the employment ID number. And, in the new structure, they didn't need to put it in, because it was there, it was findable. So they didn't have to search for an on-page search in the process. So there's a lot of benefits for top tasks if it can be properly implemented. So I'm going to look just for a few minutes at the task performance indicator. So this is measuring the performance of the top task. So basically, we take examples of the top 10 to 12 tasks, and we construct very careful instructions about those tasks, and we give them to a sample of people in a remote setting, and we measure their success rate. their ability to complete those tasks and the time it takes them. So the task performance indicator is about managing your environment based on your top tasks, that you judge success based on the success of the top task, and you judge success based on the length of time that it takes people to complete those top tasks. And that is the top task model of management. So here we see there's a 60% overall success rate and 40% failure rate. So the job of the team is to understand why is that 40% failure rate, and to reduce the time on task then as well. So here we see for years we did work with Cisco, and this was a task we were testing around a bug search, finding appropriate resolutions to bugs. And over many years it was poorly performing, and oftentimes it takes many iterations to build up a consensus for change. And then in May 2013, they ran a pilot to prove that if we do this, we believe we can significantly improve the success rate. And just with the simple pilot, success rate jumped to 50%. So then they took the pilot off, they got the budget, and then by July 2014, they implemented the full solution. And obviously there was problems with the solution, as there often are. We don't get it perfect. First time it was 35% success rate. Then by December 2014, it had jumped to 65% success rate in the process. So we're tracking and managing the tasks over time and making improvements based on improving the success rate and the time on the task. And this was another one here about a troubleshooting type task. Pretend you've forgotten the password for Cisco account and take whatever actions are required to log in. So we can see that it went 63, 77, 88, went to 100%, and then it dropped to 59%. So you always need to be continuously measuring your top tasks, even when they reach 100%, because websites and applications, etc., are fluid, and things change, and things get broken, and things get added that disrupt the journey of the top task. So to drop to 59%, identified the problem, fixed it, then by the next measurement session, it was successful again. It was back up to 100%. So when we're, analyzing this stuff, we're basically getting typically about between 15 and 20 people that we give these tasks to, a representative sample, and we're looking for basically initially findings. So if one person does something, it's just random. If two's doing the same thing, it's interesting. If 3 or more people are doing something, they're all going and typing in EIN when they get to that page, etc. That's a finding, or certainly it's a candidate for being a finding. So you in the task performance indicator, you want to deliver findings and then recommendations based on those actual findings. So here we see an example of a top task. You want to pay $300 per month over 24 months for a Yaris Excel 1.5, hatchback 5 doors hybrid, expected annual mileage 10,000. How much deposit is required? So task instructions tend to be very specific. So this is a very specific example of the overall pricing task, or what's the initial price task in the process. So password recovery, this going back to what I showed earlier, pretend you've forgotten your password. So 63% success rate, and take whatever actions are required to log in. So there was processes with the login environment. It was an old style environment. Wasn't giving you any hints as you were entering your new password. We were able to show that was causing some problems. So then they added this password strength indicator, and that definitely helped things. It was definitely a big improvement. The next round, it went up to 77%. But there was still some improvements to be made, because this password strength indicator was actually an image, and it didn't actually change as you inputted your password. And then they said, we should make it, adapt and change, and the correction appears as you put in your password. So that got changed as well in the process. So it became, it was adaptive to the behavior of putting in the password. So we saw 63, 77, 88, 100% success rate. So we're managing, over time, the success of the overall environment based on the top task. That's the task performance indicator. And we saw, there was a drop, then in May 2014 of 59%, and we fixed the problem, then it went up to 100%. So we see these issues, occurring. You're tracking this over time in the process. This was a forms environment, create a guest account. We're seeing 100% failure rate. Then it's 50%, 20. So the form is not performing well, but it's getting a little bit better in the process. This was a horrible form, 22 mandatory fields. So we made it suck just a little bit less with 11 mandatory fields, which really didn't, we only needed 4 or 5, but sometimes you can't get all the change in the first iteration. But one of the outcomes of moving from 22 mandatory fields to 11 in the process was the number of request calls that they were getting. They were getting 1,500 request calls a month connected with that form. And when we simplified it to 11, we had more work to do. They dropped to 679. So you can really track positive developments within the overall organizational environment based on improving the success rate of your top task and reducing the time on task. So I'll just finally finish off with top task classification. So top task classification can only happen as can the task performance indicator once the top tasks have been identified. So basically, we go into a sorting process with the top task results. We create hypothetical classes from that, and then we test these hypothetical classes with a bunch of task instructions, and typically it takes 3 rounds of those task instructions, and we aim for an 80 to 90% success rate in the process. So this is the model of this. Just to give you a sense of timings, I didn't tell you earlier, task identification typically takes about 12 weeks to do. It's a long, complicated, difficult process. This is not a quick fix. Task performance indicator takes 6 to 8 weeks to do, and top task classification tends to take about 8 to 10 weeks to actually do. So this would be an outcome of the classification process. So the European Commission did the task identification back around 2014, and then we used the task classification method to build this rigorous architecture for the European Commission. So here's your resulting vote. In the sorting process, we usually don't take all of the tasks. Everything ultimately gets classified. So this is a really important rule. Top task classification is for everything in the entire list of actual tasks. But the sorting process tends to lead with the top task. So typically, if there's 70 or so tasks, we might only be putting 30 or 40 into the actual sort, because we want the classification to orient itself towards the top tasks. But everything will be found. So Similarity Matrix here, we use Optimal Workshop. We also use our own software to do some extra analysis. But here, this is a Similarity Matrix. So we're seeing patterns. So once you've done your sort, you begin to see patterns. So 87% are grouping climate change and environmental protection. 80% are grouping find a job and working in an EU country. And then this is what we call often an orphan task. Typically anything below 50 in a similarity matrix is showing weak linkage. And we're seeing statistics and forecast is not well linked or not well connected with other tasks. So we've a bunch of rules of how to deal with orphans, etc. in the process. So there's lots of rules behind this and guidelines. So then we get a hypothetical structure, which is this classification here that comes out, and then we test it, typically with about 30 to 35 instructions. So this is a top task number 3, funding grants and subsidies. A researcher wants to start a new project, find out if there's an EU grant available. So again, we're going back out. Typically for the sort, you need about 15, 30 people to do the sort for reliable data to come out. So again, your target audience, etc. For the testing, the task instruction testing and the testing of the classification, you're looking ideally for 30 to 50. So we got 30, 50, policy people who are using the European Commission websites. So what do we see here? We expected them to click on funding, and 48% of them did, but 48% of them also clicked on research and innovation. So what's happening there? Well, this is a very common pattern that we found over the years, a kind of a universal pattern. And it's what I call the object and the subject. That some people think about a problem from an object point of view. So I've got a car, I've got a Prius, and I want it serviced. So some people think I want to find the car page for this, and then I look for the service environment. But other people say, no, the subject is I need to get it serviced, and then I look for the servicing for the Prius in the process. So here, if we look at this, we see some people are thinking it's a funding type of task. That's the object, but my subject is research and innovation. So some people are thinking I'll start the journey research and innovation, then I'll look for research and innovation funding. But other people think no, it's a funding journey. I'll start with funding, then I'll look for research and innovation funding. So for many tasks, there are two dominant journeys. Now, this reflects typically 80 to 90% of the actual journeys, object or subject oriented. So what we did was we sat with the European Commission team and we said, if you don't have a path from research and innovation to funding, which is specific to research and innovation, we're going to be losing a lot of people. A lot of people are going to be confused and they're not going to be able to find that funding. And of course, the implications were much broader than that. It had a big implication for, creating paths to the funding throughout the entire architecture of the European Commission. So they said, and the target was to reach 80 to 90% success rate to help people get where they wanted as quickly as possible. So it was agreed, yes, we're not duplicating the content, but we're creating a minimum of 2 paths to that actual content. So the next round, it's called the current round here, we can see the success rate, that the pattern repeated, and we were now at 92% success rate from 48% success rate. So this is the classification. Typically, it takes 3 rounds of this. Round 1 is somewhere 50-60% success rate. You make some fixes, you make some changes. Round 2, you get up to about 80%. And then if you're, it's very difficult to get to 90% or more in classification design in the process. That's an excellent achievement. 80% is a great achievement. Here we were getting up towards 90% achievement. So, and this was, one of the outcome of all that process for the classification. So, thank you very much for listening.